Don't forget to subscribe, and turn on notifications. We upload daily, and check the source of this video to view all the images and videos if there was any. More than 200 people have died in Nicaragua since unrest began 2 months ago. Protesters have taken to the streets demanding President Daniel Ortega stand down. Authorities have been accused of using lethal force to crack down on the protests. On June 24, a baby was among those killed in renewed violence, according to rights groups. Police and paramilitary forces flooded 6 neighborhoods in the east of the capital Managua, as well as the National Autonomous University of Nicaragua (UNAN), where scores of students are holed up. 2 students were killed in the university area, the rights group said. At least 3 others, including the baby, were killed in the 6 districts. Here is what we know so far. What triggered the protests? Demonstrations began on April 16, led by university students in Managua after the government failed to handle forest fires in one of the most protected areas of the Indio Maize Biological Reserve. 2 days later, the government introduced plans to cut pensions and social security, including decreasing pension payments by 5% and increasing worker social contributions by 0.75%. The change also increased employer contributions by 3.5%. I'm protesting because I'm indignant that my grandparents are going to receive 5% less of their already anemic pension, after having worked for 44 years. That's not money they are being lent, that's money they have paid in, so it bothers me, Pablo Sanchez, a protester, told Al Jazeera during the early stages of the protests. Sandinista Youth, a group aligned with Daniel Ortega's Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, launched counter-protests in support of the reforms. The government cracked down on the protests, and several people were killed, including journalist Angel Gajona, who was shot dead while reporting on the protests live on Facebook. The first fatalities were reported on Thursday, April 19, when 2 civilians and a police officer were killed in clashes. The same day, a number of television outlets were reportedly taken off the air. These are acts of repression and unexplainable censorship by the government. The government has been very secretive in releasing information to the public, but this censorship is at a new level, Miguel Mora, director of 100% Noticias, told Al Jazeera at the time. Ortega scraps pension cuts. The government maintained that the Nicaraguan Social Security Institute, INSS, was very close to insolvency and that if changes were not made, it would end without liquid assets by 2019. Ortega, the last of the Latin American revolutionaries still in office, called for a new dialogue with the private sector over the Social Security reform and welcomed modifications to implement the reforms in a better way. But in a televised meeting, aired on April 22, President Ortega scrapped the controversial reforms. In the meeting, Ortega denounced protesters for acting like gangs killing each other. We must re-establish order, we will not allow chaos, crime and looting to reign, he said. Demands for Ortega's resignation. Due to the heavy-handed tactics used by the government to curb the demonstrations, tens of thousands of people continued to protest demanding Ortega's resignation. We are fighting not only for the INSS, we are fighting for all those years of pillaging of the people by the Sandinista regime, an engineering student in Managua who identified himself as Christopher told AFP news agency during the protests. Ortega's government has faced condemnation in recent years over plans to build an interoceanic canal, for hobbling political rivals, and consolidating power when his wife, Rosario Murillo, was elected vice president in 2016. Ortega has been elected 3 consecutive times since 2007 after serving a first presidential term in the 1980s. Reactions. The UN has called for access to investigate the deaths and has accused the government of using excessive force. On May 29, Amnesty International released a report accusing the government of working with pro-government armed groups to suppress the protests. It also said authorities adopted a strategy of repression, characterized by excessive use of force and extrajudicial executions. Nicaragua's Catholic Church was serving as a mediator between the government and the protesters, calling for a reduction of hostilities and dialogue and issuing an ultimatum to the government to push for international oversight. Talks between the government and opposition broke down in mid-May. On May 31, the church issued a statement saying it would not resume talks while the Nicaraguan people continue to be repressed and murdered. On June 15, Ortega and civic leaders agreed to cease hostilities, remove roadblocks and allow for a foreign inquiry into the country's bloodiest confrontations since the civil war ended in 1990. Despite the apparent truce, violence broke out a day later and at least 8 people were killed. Both sides resumed talks, however, to address the Catholic Church's proposal to anticipate general elections and implement political reforms. Nicaragua's main business lobby urged President Daniel Ortega to hold early elections to steer the country out of weeks of destabilizing protests. The Organization of American States and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have also said they would investigate the unrest. Ortega told supporters that Nicaragua is not private property, in response to the demand, according to local newspaper La Prensa.